Welcome to Dormant Knowledge. I'm your host, Deb, and this is the podcast where you'll learn something fascinating while gently drifting off to sleep. Our goal is simple: to share interesting stories and ideas in a way that's engaging enough to capture your attention, but delivered at a pace that helps your mind relax and unwind. Whether you make it to the end or drift away somewhere in the middle, you'll hopefully absorb some knowledge along the way. If you have found this project helpful and informative during those nights when you're having a rough night of sleep, we hope you can spread the word. You can find us at dormantknowledge.com or follow us on social media at Dormant Knowledge on Instagram and Facebook, or at Dormant_Knowledge, that's DRMNT_Knowledge on X. We would also be grateful if you're able to contribute toward the production costs of this project by finding us on buymeacoffee.com at Dormant Knowledge Podcast. Any little bit helps. Tonight, we're exploring the art of invented languages, those carefully crafted tongues that bring fictional worlds to life. From the Elvish languages that roll off tongues in Middle-earth to the guttural warrior speech of Klingons, we'll discover how brilliant minds have created entire linguistic systems from scratch. So, settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin our journey into the realm of constructed languages. You know, when you think about it, creating a language from nothing is perhaps one of the most godlike acts a human can attempt. We're not just making up words, we're creating an entire system of thought, a way for minds to connect, a vehicle for culture and emotion. And yet, that's exactly what some extraordinary people have done, often spending decades perfecting languages that exist only in imagination. The term linguists use is constructed languages, or conlangs for short. Now, there are basically two types of these invented tongues. First, you have auxiliary languages. These are created with the hope that they might actually be used in the real world. Esperanto is probably the most famous example, created in 1887 by a Polish doctor named L.L. Zamenhof, who dreamed of a universal language that might bring world peace. And you know what? It sort of worked. There are actually somewhere between 100,000 to 2 million Esperanto speakers today, though estimates vary widely. But tonight, we're focusing on the other type, fictional languages, created not for real-world communication, but to bring imaginary worlds to life. And oh, the depths these creators have gone to. Let me start with the man who basically invented the entire art form of modern fictional language creation, John Ronald Reuel Tolkien. Now, most people know Tolkien as the author of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, but what many don't realize is that he was a languages first, stories second kind of creator. In fact, he once said, "I cordially hate allegory in all its manifestations. I think that many confuse applicability with allegory, but the one resides in the freedom of the reader, and the other in the purpose domination of the author." But that's getting ahead of ourselves. Tolkien was born in 1892 in South Africa, but moved to England as a small child after his father died. His mother, Mabel, was quite remarkable. She taught young Ronald Latin, French, and German before he was 12. But it was her death when he was just 12 that shaped so much of his later work. He was raised by a Catholic priest, Father Francis Morgan, who recognized the boy's unusual gift for languages. At King Edward's School in Birmingham, Tolkien didn't just learn languages, he devoured them. Classical Greek, Latin, of course, but also Gothic, Old Norse, Welsh, and Finnish. And here's where it gets interesting. He wasn't just learning these languages to read literature or historical documents. He was falling in love with their sounds, their structure, their aesthetic qualities. You see, Tolkien had what he called a linguistic aesthetic. Certain combinations of sounds just pleased him more than others. Welsh, for instance, with its flowing consonants and melodic quality, struck him as inherently beautiful. Finnish, with its elaborate case systems and vowel harmony, fascinated him structurally. And Gothic was ancient and mysterious, a Germanic language preserved mainly in a 4th century Bible translation. Now, here's something that might surprise you. Tolkien started creating his own languages as a teenager, long before he had any stories to put them in. His first attempt was called Nevbosh, which is actually a brilliant pun meaning new nonsense in the language itself, but that was just practice. The real work began when he discovered Finnish properly and started creating what would eventually become Quenya, his High Elvish tongue. By the time Tolkien reached Oxford, first as a student, then as a professor, he was already deep into what would become a lifelong project. He studied comparative philology, which is essentially the science of how languages evolve and relate to each other. Imagine spending your days tracing how Latin became Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Romanian, or how Proto-Germanic split into English, German, Dutch, and the Scandinavian languages. This wasn't just academic study for Tolkien. This was inspiration. See, most people who create fictional languages start with vocabulary. They make up words that sound good, but Tolkien approached it like a historical linguist working backwards. He imagined language families, proto-languages that split and evolved over thousands of years. Quenya and Sindarin, his 2 main Elvish languages, aren't just different vocabularies. They're meant to be related languages that diverged from a common ancestor, just like Spanish and Italian diverged from Latin. And this is where his academic background becomes crucial. Tolkien was appointed Professor of Anglo-Saxon at Oxford in 1925. Anglo-Saxon, or Old English, is this wonderfully complex language, full of compound words and alliterative poetry. You know, whale-road for sea or bonehouse for body. Tolkien spent his professional life immersed in Beowulf in the linguistic archaeology of English. But he was also fascinated by what linguists call linguistic death, languages that were lost, that we only know fragments of. There's something haunting about reading the last inscription in a dead language, knowing you're seeing the final words of an entire way of thinking about the world. And this brings us to perhaps Tolkien's most brilliant insight. He created his Elvish languages to feel ancient, to carry that same sense of linguistic nostalgia that he felt when reading Old English or Gothic manuscripts. Quenya, in particular, was designed to be the Latin of his world, an ancient, formal language that was no longer spoken in daily life, but preserved in ceremonies, poetry, and lore. I'm going to take a quick break here. When we come back, we'll dive deeper into exactly how Tolkien built these languages from the ground up and explore his philosophy that the language is the thing. Welcome back to Dormant Knowledge. Now, where were we? Yes, Tolkien's approach to creating ancient-feeling languages. You know, there's this wonderful quote from one of his letters where he says, "The stories were made rather to provide a world for the languages than the reverse." Think about that for a moment. He created Middle-earth as a place for his languages to live and breathe. The process he used was really quite methodical. He would start with what linguists call phonology, the sound system. For Quenya, he wanted something that combined the flowing, melodic quality of Finnish with some of the structural elegance of Latin. So he chose his consonants and vowels carefully. Lots of liquids, L, R, N, M. Plenty of vowels, often in combinations. Very few harsh consonant clusters. The result is a language that sounds like singing, even when you're just having a conversation. But here's where it gets really interesting from a linguistic perspective. Tolkien didn't just want his languages to sound pretty. He wanted them to feel real, to have the kind of internal consistency that comes from thousands of years of natural evolution. So he created what linguists call historical phonology. He traced how sounds would have changed over time. For example, he decided that in the ancient proto-language that gave rise to both Quenya and Sindarin, there was a sound that he wrote as que In Quenya, the sound stayed as kw, giving you words like Quenya itself, which means speech. But in Sindarin, that same ancient KW, kw, sound became just P, so the Sindarin word for speech is peth. See how that works? It's the same root, but it's evolved differently in the two languages, just like Latin, aqua, became Italian, aqua, but Spanish, agua. This kind of detail work is absolutely extraordinary when you think about it. Tolkien was essentially playing the role of thousands of years of linguistic evolution, making conscious decisions about how sounds would shift and merge and disappear. And he did this not for one language, but for multiple related languages, all with their own consistent sound changes and grammatical developments. The grammar systems he created are equally sophisticated. Quenya has 15 different cases, ways of showing how nouns relate to the action in a sentence. English basically has just two, I versus me, he versus him. But Quenya has separate cases for moving toward, moving away from, located on top of, located inside of. It's like having a grammar system designed by an architect where spatial relationships are built right into the language structure. And then there's the writing system. Tolkien created not one, but several scripts for his languages. The most famous is Tengwar, those flowing, elegant letters you see in the movies. But he also created runes and ancient scripts, and, well, you get the idea. The man was thorough. But here's what I find most remarkable about Tolkien's approach. He understood that language and culture are inseparable. The Elvish languages aren't just beautiful sounding words. They reflect Elvish values, Elvish ways of seeing the world. Quenya has multiple words for different types of light, because light and illumination are central to Elvish culture. It has elaborate ways of expressing time and memory, because elves live for thousands of years and their relationship with the past is completely different from ours. But before we move beyond Middle-earth, we should talk about the other languages Tolkien created, because they reveal just how deeply he thought about the relationship between language and culture. See, most people focus on Elvish, and rightly so. It's the most developed. But Tolkien created linguistic sketches for nearly every people in Middle-earth, and each one reflects their nature in fascinating ways. Take the orcs, for instance. Now, Tolkien had a bit of a problem with orcs, linguistically speaking. He wanted them to be capable of coordinated military action, which requires sophisticated communication. But he also wanted them to be, well, corrupted, debased, the antithesis of the noble elves. So how do you create a language that's functional but degraded? His solution was brilliant. Orcish isn't really a single language at all. It's what linguists would call a pidgin, a simplified contact language that develops when groups who don't share a native tongue need to communicate. Tolkien imagined that orcs from different regions spoke different corrupted dialects, so they communicated using this crude, simplified common tongue mixed with words borrowed from other languages. We don't get much Orcish in the books, just fragments like gash, meaning fire, or the famous Ashnaz Gjerbatuluk from the Ring inscription, which is actually in the Black Speech of Mordor. But what's fascinating is how Tolkien made even these fragments sound harsh, corrupted, where Elvish flows like water, Orcish clatters like broken stone. The Black speech itself, that Sauron's invented language, is particularly interesting because it represents Tolkien's idea of what happens when language is created not from love and aesthetic pleasure, but from the desire to dominate and control. It's regular, systematic, efficient, and completely soulless. Tolkien actually said he found it so unpleasant to work with that he didn't develop it very far. Even as a linguistic exercise, evil languages made him uncomfortable. Then there's Rohirric, the language of the horse lords of Rohan. Now here's where things get really interesting from a translation perspective, because Tolkien played a fascinating trick on his readers. He told us that the entire Lord of the Rings is supposedly translated from Hobbit writings, specifically from the Red Book of Westmarch, written by Bilbo, Frodo, and Sam. So when we read the book in English, we're not actually reading English. We're reading Tolkien's translation of Westron, the common tongue of Middle-earth. And this creates some delightful puzzles. For instance, the hobbits' real names aren't Bilbo and Frodo. Those are the translated versions. In the original Hobbit language, Bilbo's name was something like Bilba, and Frodo was Mora. In a clever twist, Tolkien decided that since Rohirric was an ancient, archaic language compared to Westron, sort of like how Old English relates to modern English, he would translate Rohirric names and phrases using Old English. So when Eomer speaks of the Ered, he's actually using an Old English word meaning cavalry troop. The Rohirrim names, Eomer, Eowyn, Theoden, these are all Anglo-Saxon style names. The Ents present their own linguistic puzzle. Tolkien imagined that Entish, the language of the tree shepherds, would be incredibly slow and deliberate, full of long, descriptive phrases that capture the deep, patient way that trees experience the world. The famous Ent name that Treebeard gives for himself, Fangorn, is actually just the Sindarin name. His real Entish name is supposedly so long and complex that it would take hours to pronounce properly, incorporating his entire history and the history of all the trees he's shepherded. It's a wonderful concept, isn't it? A language where names are basically compressed biographies, where you can't introduce yourself without reciting centuries of personal history. Very tree-like when you think about it. And then there are the dwarves. Now, Tolkien was quite secretive about Khuzdul, the dwarvish language. In his mythology, the dwarves guard their language jealously. They never teach it to outsiders, and they go by outer names in their dealings with other peoples. So Gimli's real dwarvish name isn't Gimli. That's just what he tells non-dwarves to call him. The little bit of Khuzdul we see follows Semitic language patterns. Think Hebrew or Arabic. It's built on 3 consonant roots that get modified with different vowel patterns to create related words. So the root KHZD gives us Khazad, dwarves, Khazad-dûm, the dwarf mansion, Moria, and other dwarf-related terms. It's quite different from the Indo-European patterns that Elvish follows, which makes sense. Tolkien imagined that dwarves were created separately by Ola, not descended from the same linguistic ancestors as elves and men. But here's something that shows just how deep Tolkien's thinking went. He worried about the implications of his translation conceit. If the Red Book was written in Westron and we're reading an English translation, what about all the poems and songs? How do you translate poetry? Rhyme and meter depend on the specific sounds and rhythms of the original language. Tolkien's solution was typically elegant. He claimed that where the original Red Book contained poetry in languages other than Westron, Elvish poems, for instance, he had translated them into archaic English verse forms that would give English readers a sense of their ancient formal character. So those beautiful Sindarin songs aren't actually in Sindarin as we read them. They're Tolkien's attempt to capture in English verse the feeling that a Hobbit reader would get from reading ancient Elvish poetry. All of this in-universe translation business creates fascinating problems when translating Tolkien's works in the real world into other languages. How do you translate a translation? If the English names are supposed to be translated Westron, what do you do in, say, German or French? Some translators have tried to use archaic forms of their own languages for Rohirric terms. Others have kept the English forms as foreign names. There's no perfect solution, really. For another wonderful example, in the original English, when the hobbits are in Tom Bombadil's house, they hear him singing in what's described as the ancient tongue of the elves. But we read it in English verse, so what's a French translator to do? Translate Tolkien's English verse into French verse? Try to work from Tolkien's original Sindarin and create new French verse. Leave it in English as a foreign language. Every choice creates different implications for how readers understand the linguistic layers of the story. Some translators have gotten remarkably creative. I believe the Russian translation actually attempts to preserve some of Tolkien's linguistic gains by using Church Slavonic, an archaic form of Russian, for some of the more ancient or formal passages, much like Tolkien used elements of Old English. Now, all of this linguistic complexity in Tolkien's work actually connects to a fundamental question that has fascinated linguists and philosophers for over a century. Does the language you speak shape the way you think? This idea of linguistic relativity is also popularly referred to as the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, and understanding it helps explain why Tolkien's languages feel so powerful and why modern constructed languages can be so compelling. The hypothesis is named after two American linguists, Edward Sapir and his student Benjamin Lee Whorf, who worked in the early to mid-20th century. Sapir was studying Native American languages, dozens of them, and he noticed that they carved up reality in ways that were completely different from European languages. Whorf, who was actually an insurance investigator by profession and a linguist by passion, became particularly fascinated with Hopi, a language spoken by Native American communities in what's now Arizona. Whorf claimed that Hopi had a completely different conception of time than English does, where English treats time like a spatial dimension. We talk about long periods, events being ahead of us or behind us, moving forward through time. Whorf argued that Hopi conceptualized time in terms of validity and certainty. Past events were certain and validated, while future events were potential and unmanifested. Whether Worf got Hopi right is actually quite controversial among linguists today. Many argue he misunderstood or oversimplified the Hopi temporal system. But the broader principle he was pointing to has proven remarkably durable, that different languages encode different ways of organizing experience, and that this might influence how speakers think about the world. And you can see this principle at work throughout Tolkien's languages. Take the Elvish relationship with time, for instance. Elves are immortal, so their languages have elaborate systems for discussing different types of memory, different relationships with past events, different ways of expressing the weight of accumulated centuries. When Galadriel speaks of the years beyond count, she's not just being poetic. She's using a language that's evolved to express temporal relationships that mortals simply don't experience. Or consider the cultural embedding we talked about earlier. The fact that Quenya has multiple words for different types of light isn't just vocabulary. It reflects a fundamental Elvish way of perceiving and categorizing the world. If you grew up speaking Quenya, you might literally see more distinctions between different qualities of illumination than someone raised speaking, say, English. The Entish language represents perhaps Tolkien's most extreme experiment with linguistic relativity, a language where every name incorporates complete biographical and historical information would necessarily create speakers who think about identity and relationships in completely different ways than we do. How do you have a quick conversation when introducing yourself takes hours? How do you develop a sense of individual identity when your very name is constantly expanding to include your ongoing experiences? Tolkien was certainly aware of these linguistic theories. As an Oxford professor of philology, he would have been familiar with the work of Sapir-Whorf, and you can see him experimenting with their ideas throughout Middle-earth. The black speech of Mordor isn't just evil-sounding. It's meant to be a language that shapes evil thoughts, that makes concepts like mercy or compassion difficult to express. Conversely, Elvish languages are designed to encourage noble thoughts, aesthetic appreciation, reverence for beauty and memory. Even the Rohirric use of horse-related metaphors and vocabulary reflects a culture where equestrian skills and relationships with horses are so central that they've shaped the very structure of thought and expression. When Eomar says that someone has the look of one who has ridden far, he's not just making an observation. He's thinking in categories that are fundamental to how his culture organizes experience. Now, Worf originally proposed two versions of his hypothesis. The strong version, which most linguists today consider too extreme, suggests that language actually determines thought, that you literally cannot think thoughts for which your language has no words. The weak version, which has more scientific support, suggests that language influences thought, that it makes certain ways of thinking more habitual or more readily available. The most brilliant recent example of this concept in storytelling has to be the 2016 film Arrival. Have you seen it? It's based on a short story called Story of Your Life by Ted Chiang, and it's all about linguistic relativity. The plot centers around these alien visitors. They call them heptapods because they have 7 limbs. And their written language is completely different from anything humans have ever encountered. Instead of linear writing like we use, where words follow each other in sequence from left to right or right to left, the heptapod language is written in circular, complex symbols where all the information in a sentence exists simultaneously. There's no beginning or end to their sentences. It's all just there, all at once. And here's the mind-bending part, with some mild spoilers. As the linguist protagonist learns to read and write in heptapod, her perception of time begins to change. She starts to experience her entire life, past, present, and future, as simultaneous, just like the heptapod grammar. The language literally rewires her brain to perceive reality differently. It's a stunning example of how fictional languages can be used to explore deep philosophical questions about consciousness and perception. This brings us to some of the other remarkable constructed languages that have appeared in fiction, each reflecting the cultures that supposedly speak them. Take Klingon, created by linguist Mark Okrand for the Star Trek films in the 1980s. Now, Klingons are supposed to be a warrior culture, so Okrand made some fascinating design choices to reflect that. First, there's the sound system. Lots of harsh consonants, sounds that are difficult for human speakers to produce comfortably. The language has no word for hello. Klingons apparently just start talking without pleasantries. But it has multiple words for different types of honor, different ways of describing victory and defeat. Elaborate curse words that are practically poetry. But here's my favorite thing about Klingon. The grammar is what linguists call object-verb-subject, which is extremely rare in human languages. So instead of saying, I see you, a Klingon would say something that translates literally as you see I. It's alien, it's uncomfortable for English speakers, and it perfectly reflects the idea that Klingons think about relationships and action in fundamentally different ways than humans do. And you know what's amazing? People actually learned this language. There's a Klingon Language Institute. Yes, it really exists, founded in 1992. They've translated Shakespeare into Klingon. People have held entire conversations in Klingon. There have been Klingon wedding ceremonies. I remember reading about a couple in North Carolina who raised their child speaking Klingon as a first language for the first 3 years of his life, though apparently he eventually refused to speak it and demanded English like other kids. More recently, we've had David J. Peterson, who's become something of the Steven Spielberg of constructed languages. He's created dozens of languages for television and film, most famously High Valyrian and Dothraki for Game of Thrones. Now, Peterson's approach is different from Tolkien's. He's working under television production deadlines, and he needs to create languages that actors can learn quickly enough to deliver convincing performances. High Valyrian is particularly interesting because it's supposed to be the Latin of the Game of Thrones world, an ancient, prestigious language of scholars and nobility. Peterson gave it a complex case system and verb conjugations that make it feel appropriately classical and sophisticated. But he also made sure it was regular enough that actors could actually learn their lines without spending months in language boot camp. Dothraki, on the other hand, reflects the horse riding, nomadic culture of the Dothraki people. It has an elaborate vocabulary for different types of horses, different ways of describing movement and travel. The grammar is relatively simple because, Peterson reasoned, a nomadic culture would value communication efficiency over elaborate linguistic decoration. And here's something that shows how far this art form has come. Both High Valyrian and Klingon are available on Duolingo, the language learning app. Think about that. Fictional languages have become sophisticated enough and popular enough that they're being taught alongside Spanish, French, and Mandarin. There may even be more people actively studying High Valyrian right now than are studying, say, ancient Greek. But it's not just the big-budget Hollywood languages that are fascinating. Some of the most creative linguistic work has been done for smaller projects, often by fans working without any budget at all. When we come back, we'll explore how fan communities have taken these invented languages and turned them into living, evolving forms of communication. And we'll discover what all of this linguistic creativity tells us about the nature of human language itself. Welcome back to Dormant Knowledge. One of the things that fascinates me most about constructed languages is how they've taken on lives of their own, evolving beyond what their creators ever intended. Take Tolkien's Elvish. He created perhaps 2,000 words of vocabulary across all his languages, but fan communities have expanded that into tens of thousands of words, following the grammatical and phonological rules he established. There are entire communities where people write poetry in Sindarin, translate songs into Quenya, have philosophical discussions about the proper way to address concepts Tolkien never considered. It's like watching natural language evolution happen in fast forward, but guided by conscious decisions rather than random drift. And this brings up something really interesting about how languages spread and survive. Most of the world's approximately 7,000 languages are endangered. They're spoken by small communities, often older generations, and they're gradually being replaced by more dominant languages like English, Spanish, or Mandarin. But these fictional languages, they're actually growing. They have passionate communities of speakers who are actively working to expand and preserve them. I came across this wonderful example recently. There's a linguist named Paul Frommer who created Na'vi for James Cameron's Avatar. When the movie came out, Frommer had created about 1,000 words. But fans were so enthusiastic about the language that they kept asking him questions. How would you say happy birthday in Na'vi? What's the word for internet? How do you express concepts that don't exist on Pandora? So Frommer started a blog, and then a whole online community grew up around expanding Na'vi vocabulary and grammar. Now there are dictionaries, grammar guides, people writing original literature in Na'vi. The language has grown from 1,000 words to over 2,500 words, all because people fell in love with the idea of speaking like the blue aliens from Pandora. This kind of organic growth tells us something profound about human nature, I think. We have this deep drive to communicate, to belong to communities defined by shared ways of speaking, even when those ways of speaking are completely artificial, completely invented. People will invest enormous amounts of time and energy in learning them, perfecting them, expanding them. There is actually a term in linguistics for this, language revitalization. Usually it refers to efforts to save dying languages like Hawaiian or Welsh, but now we're seeing the same techniques being applied to fictional languages. Immersion communities, grammar workshops, children's books, even university courses. The University of Oklahoma offers a course in Klingon linguistics. UC Berkeley has hosted conferences on constructed languages. There's an entire academic field now called artlanging, the study of artistic language creation. What started as a few creative individuals making up words for their stories has become a legitimate area of scholarly research. And you know what's particularly interesting? The most successful fictional languages tend to be the ones that feel the most real. That is, the ones that follow the same patterns and constraints that natural languages do. Tolkien succeeded because he based his languages on real linguistic principles. Klingon works because Mark Okrand gave it consistent grammar rules and a logical sound system, even if that system is alien to human speakers. On the other hand, languages that are just random collections of cool-sounding words tend to fade away. They don't give speakers enough structure to actually communicate, so communities can't form around them. It's like the difference between a sandbox and a set of Lego blocks. You need rules and constraints to build something lasting. This brings us to one of the most important questions about constructed languages. What do they teach us about language itself? And the answer I think, is quite a lot. For one thing, they demonstrate just how systematic and rule-governed natural languages really are. When you try to create a language from scratch, you quickly realize that you can't just make random decisions about grammar and expect it to work. Languages need internal consistency. They need ways to express all the different relationships between ideas that humans need to communicate about. They need to be learnable by children, but sophisticated enough for poetry and philosophy and scientific discourse. Constructed languages also reveal the incredible creativity and flexibility of human linguistic cognition. The fact that people can learn Klingon or Dothraki or Na'vi, languages with grammar systems that are completely unlike anything they grew up with, shows just how adaptable our language learning abilities are, even in adulthood. And there's something else. Fictional languages often explore possibilities that natural languages haven't fully developed. Klingon's object-verb-subject grammar, Ithkul's incredibly precise system for describing spatial relationships, Toki Pona's radical minimalism with only 120 to 137 words depending on who's counting. These languages push the boundaries of what human language can be. Ithkul, by the way, was created by John Quixada, and it's probably the most philosophically ambitious constructed language ever made. It's designed to eliminate ambiguity and express thoughts with mathematical precision. A single word in Ithkul can express concepts that take entire sentences in English, but it's so complex that even Quixada himself admits it takes him several minutes to compose a single sentence. It's more of a thought experiment than a practical communication tool, but it demonstrates the outer limits of what language might theoretically achieve. At the other extreme, there's Toki Pona, created by Canadian linguist Sonia Lang. It has fewer than 140 words total, and the idea is to express any concept using only these simple, basic terms. So instead of having separate words for friend, colleague, acquaintance, and buddy, you might say something like good person or person I know. It forces speakers to think about what they're really trying to communicate, to strip away unnecessary complexity. Both of these languages, the incredibly complex Ithkul and the radically simple Toki Pona, tell us something about the middle ground that natural languages occupy. Most human languages are complex enough to express sophisticated ideas, but simple enough that children can learn them naturally and adults can use them fluently in real-time conversation. That's actually a pretty narrow sweet spot when you think about it. And this brings us back to why the best fictional languages work so well in their stories. They don't just provide exotic words for the characters to speak. They reveal something about how those characters think, what their cultures value, how they organize their understanding of reality. When Tolkien's elves speak of time differently than humans do, when Klingons have no word for surrender, when the Dothraki have dozens of words for different kinds of horses, these aren't just aesthetic choices. They're insights into fictional psychology, fictional sociology, fictional ways of being in the world. There's this wonderful moment in The Lord of the Rings where Legolas and Gimli are looking at the stars, and Legolas starts reciting a poem in Sindarin about Gil-galad, the last high king of the elves. Tolkien provides the Sindarin text and an English translation, but there's something about the original that can't be captured in translation. The sound, the rhythm, the way the words seem to carry the weight of ages. That's the magic of a well-constructed language. It's not just a code or a cipher for English. It's a different way of shaping thoughts, of turning experience into meaning. When it works, really works, it makes the fictional world feel not just believable, but inevitable. Of course elves would speak like this. Of course Klingons would think in these patterns. Of course these alien visitors would organize language in ways that challenge our basic assumptions about communication. And perhaps that's the deepest appeal of constructed languages. They expand our sense of what's possible. Every natural language represents one solution to the problem of how to turn thoughts into sounds, how to make meaning shareable between minds. But constructed languages show us that there are other solutions, other ways of organizing human experience into communicable form. In a world where globalization is making languages more and more similar, where dominant languages are crowding out minority ones, there's something wonderfully rebellious about creating entirely new ways to speak. It's an assertion that human linguistic creativity is boundless, that we're not limited to the ways of communicating that history happened to give us. Whether people are learning Klingon in their spare time, writing poetry in Elvish, or creating entirely new languages for their own fictional worlds, they're participating in one of the most fundamentally human activities, the creation of meaning through shared symbols, the building of communities through common tongues. And in doing so, they're proving something that Tolkien understood from the beginning. Language isn't just a tool for communication. It's a way of being, a way of belonging, a way of making the imaginary real and the real more wonderful. Thank you for listening to Dormant Knowledge. If you're still awake and hearing my voice, I appreciate your attention. But if you've drifted off to sleep somewhere along the way, which was partly the goal, then you won't hear me say this anyway. Either way, I hope some knowledge about the art of invented languages has made it into your consciousness or perhaps your dreams. Until next time, this is Deb wishing you restful nights and curious days.